I'd like to review some information we went over during this unit that primarily focused on the Epic of Beowulf. But part of this unit started with the Anglo Saxons. And so the history of the Anglo Saxons started in Britain, at that time known as Britannia. The Celts were a tribe that occupied this region, and during this time the Romans had conquered most of England and made an agreement with the Celts, which we would call today the modern day Irish, that they could occupy the land but that the Romans owned the property. Now the Picts in the northern region of Britain were a tribe that fought against the Celts. They often marched into battle painted blue, and this was a way of mocking their opponents. We think of the Picts today as the modern day Scots. They were a war tribe, and the Celts, though they were war-focused, were more focused on peace during this time. So the Celts, losing ground against the Picts and other minor tribes, made a distress call to Rome for assistance, knowing that the Romans owned the property. During this time, though, Rome had other wars to fight. They'd spread their forces quite thin and could not respond to the call. And so in the Germanic region, there were three tribes in particular: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And these three tribes decided to join forces. They took this distress call and they hopped on their ships and sailed to Britannia to conquer it for themselves. And these Norse tribes decided to call themselves the Anglo Saxons. The goal was to start their own civilization. So they drove the Celts into what we would call modern day Ireland. They drove the Picts and other surrounding tribes to the northern region of the island, which was called Pictland, now called Scotland. And they first decided to name their new civilization Angleland, which became England, and of course now we call England. They started their own language, and this was a big part of how they became so powerful and why we look at Britain today and Britain's history and we think of the power and the influence that that country and nation has had all around the world. And not only did they start a common tongue, which we call Old English, but this language became a written language. It was a combination of Latin, French, and German from their Germanic roots. And for many years they spoke the language, but they began writing in hieroglyphics as a way to better communicate as a nation. And this is where they became more powerful and more influential to the nations around them. So before they started the written language, they used something called oral tradition. And this is the passing down of stories through time, through memorization. Somebody would be selected to be a poet in the community. They would learn the stories, the tales, the epics, the sagas of their people and pass it down to the next generation. So a bard, also known as a poet, would script the story in their mind and retell the story to preserve the culture. The best example of early Anglo-Saxon writings would be Beowulf. This is an Anglo-Saxon epic. The book had two anonymous authors. We talked about this in class. The first author, of course, was the bard. The first author started the thought of Beowulf. Through time, Beowulf began to form an oral tradition. And then as England, Great Britain, formed their language, Roman priests and evangelicals came and converted the king to Christianity. And it's at this time that somebody decided to put the tale to text. They decided to write Beowulf. And so Beowulf is a combination of Norse tradition, Norse mythology, and also it has Christian elements, making this text a blending of cultures. Since Beowulf started in the Norse region, or in the Nordic region, it's really not an English epic. It's considered an English epic, but it's kind of ironic that we call it so. Since the epic takes place in Denmark and Gotland, which would be modern-day Sweden. For many years, the epic was studied from a historical perspective, there's a lot of history in this epic that we didn't necessarily look at in class. But years later, it was starting to be viewed as a piece of literature. So when we think of an epic is a long narrative poem that typically tells a tale of a hero going on a journey. The journey includes many trials, enemies, temptresses, hardships, typically demons, beasts, mythological creatures, and all of these things threaten the completion of the journey. That's the idea. The hero goes on a journey, things threaten that journey, and for the hero to prove himself, in this case, as a hero, he has to conquer these trials. And most heroes have an epic flaw. In this case, we call it a tragic flaw. A tragic flaw is kind of a personality trait that leads to the downfall and death of the character. So when you think of Odysseus from the Odyssey, his was hubris or pride. In the case of Beowulf was also pride. He chose to fight the dragon in his old age because he did not want to admit to himself that he was not the man he used to be when he faced Grendel. So when we think of the hero is the embodiment of the culture. In other words, the hero represents everything the culture considers to be ideal. The morals, the ethics, customs, expectations. For example, the Norse culture was very focused on war, so it makes sense that our hero would be an extremely strong, brave, valiant person who also happens to be a great warrior. In our culture today, if we think of a fictional or non-fictional hero, typically that person does something or represents something that we admire. So when we consider movies, television, music, we consider the fact that that represents what we feel a person should represent in our culture in the same way. So of course epics have something called conventions. This refers to the way things are typically done. In the case of epics, how they're written or formatted. So for example, all epics have a hero. They have a journey, they have supernatural forces, typically gods or goddesses, a king or kingdom, battles, epithets, kennings, and many more things that we discussed in class. There are a few literary devices we've reviewed a few times in class. They're also available in this PowerPoint. One of the first is kenning. This is common in Anglo Saxon writing. This is when a metaphor replaces a single noun with a phrase. So for example, instead of saying Grendel, the text says that shadow of death. Instead of saying Hrothgar, it says the ring giver. Instead of saying the sun, it says heaven's candle. And you'll notice that many of these phrases are hyphenated. They're connecting the words together to replace the name of a character, or in the case of heaven's candle, the name of a thing. Caesure is another example. It's an obvious pause in writing, usually during battle scenes. This would help to emphasize the hero tearing the enemy to shreds or lopping the head off of a character or a fictional beast. Personification, giving human attributes to inanimate objects or ideas. One of the best examples from our reading was when Hrothgar's sorrow is being described as being heaped at his door. It's a human quality. The only way for sorrow to be heaped is to be heaped or piled by a person. But it's much more descriptive than simply saying that Hrothgar was upset or sorrowful at the death of his people. And allusion is one of the last examples we reviewed in class. This is a reference to another text. So for example, Beowulf is described as a Christ-like hero, or Grendel is described as being a descendant of Cain. It's not the story itself. You have to know the story when you see the reference or hint to another text, but it helps to emphasize another point, in this case about the characters. So something else important to realize as you study Beowulf or as you're studying for your quiz is the influence of Norse mythology. So Norse is a term that's used to describe tribes and kingdoms in the northern region of Europe. You could also use the term Nordic. Norse mythology follows the tradition and belief in many gods, practices of sacrifice, omens, prophecies, and most importantly, the belief of fate or divine destiny. In the case of Beowulf, we also discussed the emphasis on fame. The Norse did not believe in an eternal afterlife. They believed in an opportunity for those who were honored for their victories in war to fight in a final battle. But after that final battle, they and the gods that they worshipped would die. Ultimately, there was a final death, and so fame was their way of living on after death and becoming legendary. An example of Norse mythology in our culture is the days of the week. The only day of the week that's not named after a Norse god is Saturday. And as you can see, this came from the ancient Romans. This is Saturn's day. But every other day of the week is named after a Norse god. And this just gives an example of today where, if we take the time to notice some of our traditions, customs, even holidays represent elements of the Norse culture. Just as Beowulf represents elements of the Norse culture, and it's also mixed with Christian elements as well, or biblical elements. So this is the PowerPoint that you have to review. I thought I'd go through it as an audible example for those who are absent, or for those who have any further questions.